Well, here we are, the last main video for my Phantasy Star series retrospective, the game that was released for PSO's 10th anniversary and that I'm now talking about as we approach the 25th. And as a turning point of sorts in the series, it makes a great subject. Yes, today we finally reached the game that many comments have been asking about, Phantasy Star Portable 2 Infinity, which to be clear is the updated re-release with the base game just being Phantasy Star Portable 2. This game straddles the line between two eras of the franchise. The base game was, for nearly 10 years until PSO2's very belated Western release, the last Phantasy Star game to ever leave Japan. Because the base game sold very poorly in the West, we never got Infinity, though thankfully a translation patch exists to save us. Actually, the franchise in general wasn't doing too hot in the West, as Phantasy Star Universe's Western servers were closed before Portable 2 even released in the West. So that could have also driven some decision making around Infinity and PSO2. But Infinity is also a transitional game because it was the last one before PSO2 fundamentally changed the series away from this vibrant era of more frequent sequels and spin-offs. This is a reminder that everything I've covered in this retrospective series, from the original Phantasy Star Online all the way through the original release of PSO2 and its early updates, that was all in the first half of this series' 25-year history. On top of that, it was also important in terms of how it played. Despite sounding like this should be just another PSU port like Portable 1 was, it is absolutely its own beast. Portable 2 does to PSU what Zero attempted to do to PSO, only infinitely more successfully, blending existing mechanics with more exciting action gameplay. And the result is a game that still stands as one of the high points of the series, as evidenced by the fact that it is by far the game people ask about the most on this channel. Oh, and if you haven't watched my Portable 1 video, and especially my PSU video, you probably should, unless you're already familiar with those games, because I will be talking about this game and what it does, mostly in comparison to those games. And I am just going to focus on Infinity here, for similar reasons to why I mostly just talked about Blue Burst back when I covered the original PSO. It's the most complete version, and having more to do is already a pretty big leg up, and most of the changes I have noticed about this version seem pretty positive compared to what I remember of the base game back in the day. Plus, look, these games are already a huge time investment to get to a point where I feel comfortable doing a video on them, so adding probably at least 100+ hours onto the time investment needed to include details that would mostly amount to trivia just does not feel worth it to me. But let me know in the comments if you're better educated about the version differences and think there's anything in the base version of Portable 2 that was better than Infinity, besides, being a game you could buy and play in the West. But enough with the introductions, we've got quite a lot to cover. This time we're starting with gameplay. Since this is a Gurhal Saga game, a lot of it will be familiar if you've played PSU or Portable 1. If you're not familiar, maybe my PSU video can help with that. Link is up there in the card right now. But the game makes some big changes to lean more into action, and these changes have a ton of potential. To start with, photon points are now, well, it's how you know it if you've played either half of PSO2. At least mostly. Photon points are a property of your character again, not your weapon like the earlier Gurhal games, and the pool is small and can only be increased slightly with certain skills, but also refills rather quickly as well, creating an ebb and flow. Personally, this is my favorite system for technique or photon points. I do enjoy an old-fashioned MP system, but the PSO series, even the original, always suffered from a common problem with these systems, which is that the items you used to restore your TP were just so plentiful that it didn't really matter. Heck, in most of these, it's even quite easy to return to town if you do go through all your restoring items, so it just does not limit you meaningfully at all. So there's no real loss in terms of resource management, and the system adds a nice rhythm to the combat. Plus, the totals here are low enough that striking weapons can't just spam their photon arts anymore, and ranged and teching weapons have to pace themselves to not run out too quickly. It's great. Then there's also the new-ish feature of chains. They were in Zero, but they were way harder to use there and barely came up in solo play, so Portable 2's implementation of them is basically a whole new system. The basic gist is that you build up a chain by hitting enemies with the attack on square, and then break the chain with triangle, giving the breaking attack and any other chain breakers within a window a sizable damage boost. According to the Portable 2 Infinity wiki, any chain adds 100% damage, plus 12.5% per hit in the chain in single player, or 7.5% per hit in multiplayer. I like the concept, but I do think it's just a little too over-centralizing, putting all the focus on killing power. I probably would have dropped the massive 100% damage boost just for having any chain at all, and made it just the bonus you get based on chain count. But because chains let you deal so much damage so quickly, while animations and area of effect are still important, using photon arts to juggle or knock back enemies feels far less important. Instead, you're mostly focused on building up your chains to devastate enemies in a single finisher. Also, I should probably mention the AI partners are really bad with chains, and some of them, mostly on tech weapons, seem to have intentionally awful setups like setting rapid hit attacks as chain breakers instead of chain builders. But despite my complaints about it being one more step towards everything just being focused on hitting things as hard as possible, the system is fun. The possibility of losing a chain means skilled play is still rewarded, and the player is fragile enough that it is still tense. Even if it isn't as methodical, which I do tend to prefer in my action RPGs, it is at least still exciting. Though the fragility may be to balance for the next change, which is that in the vein of Zero, you now have rolling and guarding. The former is available at all times, while the latter can be used with two-handed weapons, including twin weapons, or by equipping your shield in your offhand, with shields granting a better block than weapons do. Though here, unlike most other games in the series, rolling and guarding will both consume some photon points to use. I really like this when combined with how the photon point system works. There's a good reason some of the most popular action RPGs like Monster Hunter and FromSoft's offerings have your defensive actions tied to a stamina system. It forces you to pace things, to still consider positioning even when you have the ability to negate attacks, to sometimes break away and reposition to recover, and to make sure you time your reactions properly and don't spam. It helps avoid situations like in New Genesis where most classes can just effectively ignore positioning and just stop everything with well-timed defensive actions, which I find much less engaging than having to time your defensive actions while also jockeying for position around the monsters. Also, like Zero, missed attacks now deal no damage without any block animation playing, though unlike Zero, it keeps more of its old stat balance, which means that accuracy is still very much something that you can end up not having enough of and having a very bad time. But to balance out the fact you can now more easily avoid damage, you can also take much less of it. Your character is a lot less tanky, and you can also carry significantly fewer healing items. You're back down to only being able to carry 10 mates of each type, and down to only one scape doll at a time, 2 with a certain skill. This mostly still works. I don't find myself running out of healing items very often at all, especially since everyone can use techniques again, so you can always rely on Resta to heal between encounters and save the items for quick panic healing. But the limited number of scape dolls does lead to some cheap failures, and this is all affected significantly because you can no longer return to town mid-mission for, I think, the first time in the series. This means no running back to resupply everything, and I do mostly like this. If we still had the old system for technique or photon points, this would be especially nice, since it'd mean the costs of the techniques you used actually mattered, rather than just popping a fluid when you run low and popping back to town when you run low on those. But this does mean that the single scape doll is something you really feel. And look, I kind of have to harp on about this, because while it's mostly fine, I probably would have let the player have 3 scape dolls. One is just really rough with how much these games love to one-shot the player. That aspect of Phantasy Star Universe is alive and well. Of course, maybe this is all mostly because I'm soloing this. If you were playing with other people with revival items, it's probably not so bad. And in fact, having allies with revives probably swings it too far the other way. This is a real issue with party-based games, with revives being far too game-changing in ability, and it's something I want to talk about a bit more next time I get to talking about Monster Hunter again. But hey, at least failure only kicks you back to town. One of the most jarring and unpleasant experiences in PSU's offline mode was getting a game over and having to reload a save. I was not used to that in these kinds of online-focused action RPGs. But I guess the balancing here is just kind of awkward. I don't really like when action RPGs become mostly about avoiding being one-shot, but at the same time anything that is less than that is largely meaningless. There's just too much slack for minor injuries, but the single scape doll is not enough slack for when you get one shot. I mean, it's not the worst either. I do appreciate the level of difficulty most of the time, and I still probably prefer it to the amount of constantly downing trimates that I did in PSU. But it's just not quite up to par in action combat with something like a Monster Hunter or Souls game. Which is understandable because those games were built from the ground up to be what they were, while Portable 2 is building on top of Phantasy Star Universe. But while we have all these changes, we still have the 3 classic combat styles of melee, ranged, and space magic, and they've each handled the addition of these new mechanics a little differently. For melee, well, it has the least specific changes, but honestly most of the changes made to the combat in general feel like they were made with melee combat first and foremost in mind. The changes to photon points, for instance, mix very well with melee weapons restoring photon points on normal attack hits. This has actually been in the Gerhal games since Ambition of the Illuminous, but the effects were just so minor and photon charges were cheap and plentiful, so being able to restore your photon points with melee weapon hits just wasn't very useful. But with the smaller photon point pools and the removal of photon chargers, suddenly this feature is extremely helpful, especially when contrasted with the other weapon types that have to expend photon points to use their basic attacks. Plus, this leads in with chains seemingly designed for melee weapons, being the only weapon type that already had distinct normal and special attacks. The aforementioned photon point recovery makes it very natural to build up a chain while restoring your photon points before unleashing a photon art. And even if this didn't restore photon points, well again, it's just nice to be able to build a chain without expending photon points. And then of course the new defensive options are going to be the most relevant when you're up in the enemy's face. The only real change particular to melee that I can think of also relates to a unique trait of melee weapons, which is the photon art combos. Now two-handed weapon photon arts with a combo will start with the first 2 hits unlocked, and unlock the 3rd hit at level 11 when one-handed photon arts unlock their 2nd hit. This is minor, but I guess I felt I needed to mention it somewhere. But yeah, there's not a lot to say about melee. It has changed the least, and the general combat changes suit it the best. As for ranged weapons, they build chains with their regular shots, which are just what they had in Phantasy Star Universe, but to break chains, they've gained charged shots. In the original version of Portable 2, these were just what you'd expect really, just a bigger version of the normal attack. But in Infinity they added alternative charge shots, which when a weapon got was random when it dropped, but could be switched for a small fee, and these could often be the kind of stylish attacks you'd expect from a striking weapon's skill photon arts. though some of them do fall pretty short, like handguns randomly having a weak healing effect that's only useful if you don't have Resta yet, or rifles having a rain of shots from the sky that's really awkward to use. And since there's only one alternative charge shot per weapon class, yeah, if you don't have a good one, you might be stuck with the basic one. Though unfortunately it's not all good for ranged characters since they lost the elemental bullets and became more damage focused, following Phantasy Star Zero largely stripping ranged combat of its status effect focus. Elements now work like they do on melee weapons, which is definitely worse, and this also means that weapons having status effects is largely random rather than being guaranteed by your bullets. And now bullets are much more plain. Each ranged weapon has 5 bullet types: damage focused, accuracy focused, range focused, cost reducing, and then a 5th special type that is different from weapon to weapon, but like half the special bullets are well-rounded ones that boost your elemental percentage, and I feel like these kind of overshadow all of the others. The devs almost do something cool with accuracy here that's reminiscent of the original PSO by making the power bullets reduce your accuracy and thus making them risky to use if you're not a ranger. Letting rangers deal more damage with ranged weapons this way is clever, but it's also kind of redundant. Ranged weapons now scale with your character's base accuracy more than they scale with your character's base attack power, which, while this does help to ensure rangers are the best with ranged weapons, it does further pigeonhole the best into just meaning does the most damage, whereas I preferred the more interesting method of having ranged weapons be particularly well suited to inflicting status effects. Also, because there's still the fixed left-right hand system for weapons, one-handed guns can't be used with shields, so no cool riot shield builds. Closest you can get is a shield plus a slicer. Then, as for other changes, cards and bows now scale with technique power in place of attack power, which previously only ranged mags for some reason did. And even the photon art level caps are based on your type's tech level cap instead of their bullet level cap. So ranged combat's kind of a mixed bag. It doesn't match the new mechanics as well as melee does, since its basic attacks spend photon points instead of restoring it, and it lost some of the distinctive role as the status-focused playstyle. But the charge shots do make them far more dynamic and exciting to play, though sometimes the charge times and the fact you can start a charge but not finish it if you don't have enough photon points can make them a little awkward to use compared to other weapons' chain breakers. Maybe ranged weapons were always going to struggle with moving to more action-y combat, since in PSU they were very much the boring but pragmatic option. Back in PSO they were the oops, we accidentally gave this playstyle a bunch of overtuned weapons option. As for techniques, space magic for those somehow watching this video without knowing anything about Phantasy Star, well, techniques get a little bit more interesting stuff than ranged weapons. Whether they build or break chains is now dependent on the button you assign a tech to, which does add a unique bit of customization. Whichever tech you assign to square will build a chain, and whichever tech you assign to triangle will break it. And certain techs really work great as chain builders. Stuff like Foverse and Subarta stand out here for being quick casts that deal a lot of hits and don't require you to stand still for too long, and you can throw them up and still hit with other things while they're attacking. There's also the addition of a 3-hit combo for attacks, which makes things a little faster and just makes casting techs generally feel a little better than in PSU, especially with simple techs, which can actually make great damage dealing chain breakers if you're dealing with a single tough target. Rods get a weird, unique mechanic in that they can block like other two-handed weapons, but only if they do not set any techniques to their secondary palette slots. I suppose it works as a way to give them the option of blocking with a rod while still letting rods keep their unique secondary palette. Though as for less great changes, elements are now a random trait on weapons. Like with ranged weapons, they were changed to be more in line with melee weapons, but here it's kind of weird and confusing. In Universe, techniques mostly got their elemental percentage from their level, and equipping weapons with only techs of one element would give it an additional elemental percentage that would be added in. Here, at baseline, every technique is treated as being effectively a 0% elemental attack in the associated element, which still does matter because simply using the right or wrong element provides a 30% increase or decrease before factoring in the percentage itself. Then it gains a 5% elemental bonus for each tech of the same element on the weapon, though unlike PSU, even just one tech provides this boost, and having techs of multiple different elements does not remove the boost. And then, on top of all of this, if the weapon's element matches the technique being used, the weapon's elemental percentage is added. It's honestly kind of annoying that techs get a little shafted here. They're stuck with the same percentage mechanics that melee weapons had to deal with, but unlike ranged weapons, they don't get a smaller array of photon arts that they have to keep up with in order to compensate for this. Though at least they did get to keep their reliable ability to inflict status effects. Oh, and speaking of status effects and weird damage mechanics, techniques also get another one. By using a technique, and only a technique, this doesn't apply to elemental attacks with striking or ranged weapons, on an enemy inflicted with certain status effects, the technique will deal 35% more damage. And the status effect you need is always one associated with the opposite elemental technique. So, an ice tech on a burning enemy or a fire tech on a frozen enemy. I don't know if this is indicated anywhere. I stumbled across it on the wiki while looking up stuff for another point. Maybe it's buried in a bit of tutorial dialogue somewhere. There's a lot of tedious, though thankfully optional tutorials. This mechanic seems interesting. It's maybe not something you want to lean entirely into because the setup does require opposing elements, but I actually think it might be potentially quite good with the right setup. For instance, Sabarta is an ice tech that is quite good at both freezing enemies and building chains, so with how useful freeze is, I could see this being useful for setting up for fire techs. I don't know, I wasn't fond of this at first glance, but maybe I'm warming up to it, although maybe for the setup it requires it could be a little more exciting. But lastly, and genuinely one of my favorite changes, the support techs got consolidated back down. It's now just the classic PSO 2 buffs, 2 debuffs. The accuracy, evasion, and tech power altering effects that were in PSU's additional support techs got folded back into these. And this is nice, not needing to use the health draining Megastar or devote an entire palette slot to have all 4 buffs. And Resta, Anti, Shifta, and D-Band fit nicely onto one rod or a wand plus tech mag combo. Already handy for a dedicated techer, but particularly valuable because of some of the system changes. Unless you're playing in a party where someone is a force, and thus has access to the best versions of the support techs, everyone can and should pack buffing and healing techs, so not having to take up too much of your palette for that is very much appreciated. And so techs probably get some of the most interesting changes here. It's not as perfectly suited to the systems as Melee is, but it feels like techs didn't lose as much of their old identity as ranged weapons did. So the changes are mostly pretty good, although there are some issues around the enemies. I mean, PSU already had one of the weaker enemy rosters in the series due to the heavy reskinning, though I will say that the enemies surprisingly aren't too badly mismatched with the gameplay changes. It's pretty rare that you have enemies that are just obviously awful and not designed for this game. There's probably some subtle tweaks that I overlooked that help with this or something. Unfortunately, they do still have the issue they had in PSU, which is that it feels like the enemies rarely elevate the game just due to the limited variety of them. One nice change to the enemies though is that most large enemies only have 1 hitbox, with a select few having 2 and bosses still having plenty. And everything's balanced around this, and I just like it because it fixes the sort of issue PSU had, where with large enemies, some of them just arbitrarily had fewer hitboxes and were vastly harder to kill because of it. Though boss fights aren't great. Some do feel better than in PSU, but the issues resulting from the player being more fragile are definitely most noticeable in boss fights. Although actually I think the worst bosses are the new ones made specifically for this game. I actually find myself dying to some random bullshit more to the new bosses than the old ones. Dishonorable mention to the final boss of episode 2, which is extremely painful and just takes forever to deal with. Most of the bosses aren't that bad, thankfully. And then a small nice change is that you can now set multiple line shields to your palette, and even configure them with different unit setups if you prefer. Minor, but a nice inclusion, and the fact you can set up multiple armors with different units can be nice on characters whose blasts are linked to armor units. Overall, the combat still feels like an upgrade over PSU, but the ways in which they unnecessarily downgraded parts of the game at the same time make it frustrating. The action combat is probably my favorite in the franchise. I like that this is the only combat system from the more action-focused era where you are still heavily encouraged to frequently swap weapons to use what is best for a given situation. Deciding what weapon to use at a given moment was one of the big parts of PSO's gameplay loop, so it's a shame that later games have lost that. But it is still a shame that Portable 2 has curtailed some of the RPG depth to reach this point. Rangers just kind of being gun DPS and not dedicated status classes is very disappointing to me. So now the other key half of all of these games, the character systems. And there's a surprising number of changes compared to PSU. Starting with the changes to the various playable races, the changes to how photon points work means that the races affect a couple of extra things, and they're pretty big. Your photon point maximum and regeneration rate are determined by your character's race and sex, but not your class, and do not increase as you level up, unlike most other stats. Newmen get the best of both. Humans and beasts have average values, with beasts having slightly lower maximum but the same regeneration rate as humans. Castes have the lowest photon point cap, but slightly better regeneration than humans and beasts, and the new Dooman race has the second worst maximum and the worst regeneration. And this is actually one of the few things I know for certain changed from base Portable 2. If I remember the discussions from PSO World back in the day, in that game, photon point regeneration was percentage based instead of a fixed value, with castes exclusively having an increased regeneration rate that was considered to be extremely strong, and I believe in total actually gave them faster regeneration than Newman's higher base photon points. So this rebalance might be for the best. It also does have the quirk of making these stat differences from your character's sex more impactful, which I'm not really a huge fan of, but it is what it is. With most stats, the sex with the better value will have around a 5% increase to that stat. It's not nothing, but it's not really that huge unless you're concerned with min-maxing, and because this sort of design is a little outdated anyway, the PSU private server just gives the better value in all stats regardless of your character's sex. But in Portable 2 Infinity, female characters gain an extra 20 photon points, except female casts who only get an extra 10 over their male counterparts. And female characters also get an extra 1 photon point regenerated per second, except for female Doomen, who don't get a bonus to regeneration. While this doesn't sound like much, only Newman and female humans have over 200 max photon points without skills, and only Newman have only 10 points a second regeneration, so for most races this is over a 10% bonus. Moving on, one bit of big news is that humans and Newman gained Mirage Blasts, a blast mechanic all their own with 6 types, 1 for each element. These are absolutely classic photon blasts, summoning a creature to do a big thing. They even fit the main classic styles of photon blast. Fire and Ice are powerful linear attacks, Lightning and Earth are radial AoEs with crowd control effects, and Light and Dark are buffs. Light is exclusive to Newman, while Dark is exclusive to humans. Like it casts SUV weapons, the blast module is an armor unit. This takes up a slot, but it does mean they can be swapped mid-mission if you like. Kind of a shame they had to share their blasts, but at least they finally get something, and this is better than PSU's solution of giving them weaker SUVs. Even if these function very similarly, the flavor change does help. Beast's nanoblasts now make them invincible. The existing nanoblasts were tweaked to account for this, plus they gain some new ones. And I do think giving them all invincibility is for the best, just from a balancing perspective. In PSU, I always found the invincibility blast too good because it meant I could spend more time attacking. But here I tend to really favor the new ones. The new gold and silver nanoblasts are pretty cool with unique models, move sets, and the ability to enter a berserk mode. And these movesets feel significantly better for the revised gameplay. The older nanoblasts just felt awkward and janky. Then, as mentioned, there's a new fifth race, the Dooman, though they have different lore and aesthetics than their PSO2 counterparts. They're a glass cannon race with second best in class values in all three offensive stats, but the worst defensive stats and the worst photon point recovery. But also along with this, humans were given a defensive focus to split the generalist role in a way that is much more interesting. But yeah, Dooman are not as exciting as they sound, but they are still pretty fun. They also have the new blast system for their blast gauge, which basically gives them a powerful energy weapon for a limited time. They're extremely cool, they don't take up a gear slot, they're automatically unlocked at level 10, and the form they take is decided entirely by your type. But, like the old PSU version of nanoblasts, they don't make you invulnerable, fitting the glass cannon style, so they can be quite risky. But while they're not always the best, they are conceptually my favorite blast type, just because I think it's cool to temporarily gain a supercharged weapon based on your class. Oh, and casts, aside from, as mentioned, having the unique quirk of low photon points but high photon point regeneration, they're basically the same as ever, including their SUV weapons. But then on to classes, or types, as I will always forget to call them. Okay, this system's kind of a downgrade. There's just 4, and there's no more basic advanced split. There's Hunter, Ranger, and Force doing their traditional things, and Vanguard, known as Braver in Japanese, which is basically Portable One's Acromaster. A high evasion, jack of all trades that favors one-handed weapons, plus Pro-Transer's trap expertise. Pro-Transer as the heavy weapon specialist is just gone entirely. This is fine in light of the other changes to types, but I still miss the variety of universes classes. Though, to be fair, PSU's type system could have gotten a little unwieldy with the other changes here, such as the first appearance of a proper skill system in this franchise, but not a skill tree like in the PSO2 games. Instead, you unlock skills by increasing the level of your types, and you have a number of skill slots to use to equip them. Each type has a mostly unique list of skills to unlock by leveling it up, but once you unlock them, all but a few can be equipped by any type. And you can gain additional skill slots by leveling a type or through rebirths, which I'll get to in a moment. It's not the deepest, and it's purely passive buffs, but it's a solid start, and I like that it gives you a reason to consider leveling multiple types. And then there's the Extend system replacing type-based weapon proficiencies. Instead of having a set max rank for each weapon class for a type, you have a pool of Extend points, which increases with type level, and you assign these to increase your weapon ranks. The cost varies with how suited your class is for the weapon, though they can be reassigned freely. It's an interesting system, but I'm not the biggest fan. It has the effect of making classes less distinct because any class can use any weapon with investment, but it also feels a bit restrictive. You can't necessarily just pick up a new weapon type if you happen to get a good drop, even if it does suit your type, and especially once you start getting S-ranked weapons, you will start finding yourself really short on extend points. Kinda spoils the fun of getting an S-rank weapon when you need to raise your type level to equip it. But the system does at least fit with the limited type selection, so I guess it works. I guess it just could maybe do with being a little more generous if it's trying to go back to the original PSO style, where everyone is expected to do a bit of everything. As it stands, it kind of feels like the worst of both being too open and too limiting. Then there's rebirths, which are basically a level reset or prestige system. Past level 50, you can reset to level 1 to gain a few bonuses, points you can spend to increase your stats, increased type level cap, and once you've rebirthed once, regardless of the level you do it at, all of your types gain a whopping 4 extra ability slots, out of a 12 maximum possible, so this is a big deal. This isn't quite infinite progression. You will eventually cap your stats and only be able to get extend codes by rebirthing, but in order to max out your stats, you'll need to rebirth a minimum of 6 times. 5 at the level cap of 200, and once more at 109 or higher. And I would also recommend getting one type level to 20 before you rebirth, because that gets you an ability that increases the XP gain by 25%, which can be very helpful for leveling back up. I want to like this, but I really don't. Level grinding is always the least interesting part of progression in a PSO game, and so encouraging you to do more of it is not interesting to me at all. I think the devs know the level curve is a problem, but their solution was to give you a pair of missions that are really good for farming EXP. Gurhal Heroes and the Magashi Plan. And I don't think this is a great solution because it shows they're aware of the need for faster leveling, but the solution just makes the game more repetitive while you're leveling, because the only practical way involves a lot of playing a small number of missions over and over again. Of course, the game still wouldn't have had the same sense of freedom that PSU had. Leveling in that game was made a lot more pleasant because there were so many different ways to progress while you're also gaining EXP. And maybe some of this is just because I'm used to the EXP boosted private servers with PSO and PSU, but I think that ends up just showing the fact that these games at base are really not tuned to have a particularly pleasant EXP curve. But at least my first rebirth was kinda fun, getting to just level freely, not worrying about the story, and being able to push things a bit harder to level up quicker because I had 12 ability slots, rebirth stat boosts, and a high type level. Honestly, this is closer to the experience I wanted out of this game, because I actually just really missed the open-ending leveling experience of PSU Online. Now for the story. Do we have to do this? I really don't like being so overwhelmingly negative. We do? Okay, fine, I'll try and keep this whole thing short. I will say this, at least unlike in the first half of Ambition of the Illuminous, it feels like you do matter here. The story still isn't about you, which is probably best for a multiplayer game anyway, but at least you're kind of like the ace fighter here and kind of the catalyst for some of the story stuff. You're not just the sidekick of the actual main character like you were in AOTI. But there's a big issue here, which is simply that none of this story plays to the strengths of the Gurhal saga. The world feels small. The various factions barely play any part in it. It feels like your party is the center of the world, very much unlike the PSU base offline, and it doesn't even have the apocalyptic feeling of the AOTI story, despite indeed being pretty apocalyptic in the final stakes. Maybe some of the lack of scale is down to technical limitations, since you can't visit all the different planets, and the lobby on Clad 6 is pretty minimal and pragmatic. It doesn't help that the story is very, The best way to describe it is that it often feels like a negative stereotype of anime as imagined by someone who doesn't particularly like anime. And then another issue leading to probably some of these writing problems is that both episode 1 and 2's plots feel very much like they're the result of being forced to come up with new conflicts in a solved setting, and not being willing to go smaller. You gotta have the fate of the galaxy be the focus, I guess. Even though past Gurhal stories prove you can just be trying to protect your friends in the middle of the crisis, and that can be compelling enough. But yeah, there's just not a lot left to do, so they had to make some shit up. Because they've already dealt with the seed, they've dealt with the evil conspiracy. Hell, as far as I can tell, they might have solved racism. That was a big driver of the conflict in the setting in PSU, but I don't think there's any hints of it in Portable 2. Really, I don't blame anyone who hates the game primarily for the story, especially because you can't really ignore it. You have to do the story mode to unlock free play missions. And it's very easy to miss the fact that you have to hold down the start button for longer than you think to skip text. Unfortunately, this does not work on the tutorial pop-ups, which you will have to deal with in the first mission every time you create an alt. Although there is an optional game mod on the wiki that will let you just skip the story, so if you find it unbearable, go for that. Hell, if you just hate being dragged along for a story on this kind of game, go for that. Anyway, spoilers if you care. Skip to the next chapter if you do. Episode 1 is definitely the worst of the two, with two arcs, each bad in unique ways. The first arc is just a front row seat to a dysfunctional family situation, and it's kind of just uncomfortable, and even as they develop out of it, it's not exactly satisfying. And then the second half is just extremely cliché. The main villain is the King of the Ancients, the ones who made all those ruins that you explore in the Gurhal setting, and his plan is to revive his people, which would be catastrophic for those currently living in Gurhal. There's potential, but they ultimately end up just ruining the Ancients by making them no longer a mystery, because he is just evil. He does not care about his people and just wants to rule over them again. And all of the other Ancients are waved off with an implication that they were decadent and bad anyway, along with some lame-ass platitude about how their time had passed. They could have gone for any interesting conflict here, either a tragic scenario where there's no good outcome, or maybe there is hope and you actually can find a way to live in harmony, but no, it's basically background noise to a generic doomsday villain. And the bad cliches don't end there either. You know that thing where a character walks in on a conversation, ends up doing so at just the wrong time and gets the wrong idea, and instead of asking what's going on, they scream and run off, creating the most artificial drama possible? Yeah, that's in this game, and I hate it. Plus there's the bit where you channel the collective will to live of the people of Gurhal into a laser to blast your way through the waves of despair radiating from the final dungeon. Somehow they managed to find something even more tacky and forced than love, friendship, hope, or the like to channel into a laser. There's still some strong moments, but I find they usually involve the characters that aren't as important, because while those characters are more static, at least they're not primarily defined by the thing that makes them annoying. Plus, these characters do get to be cool, and they actually have some pretty good, interesting characterization. Chelsea is a favorite of mine, because while at first she seems like sexy robot girl with a funny French accent, there's actually a good bit to her, and most notably, there's a lovely little optional conversation with her where she brings up wanting to live a peaceful life, specifically because she used to be in the military, and at that time she found herself becoming more and more alone. Now I'm starting to wonder why they managed to get the side characters so right, but the main characters so wrong. At least episode 2 is better. It's a little weird in that it's set between the final battle of episode 1 and the epilogue of episode 1 that is set a year later. So it's a little jarring if you beat episode 1, get a where are they now epilogue, and then play episode 2 and find out that nobody's in the places we said they were yet. Then the main thing about episode 2 is that it switches the lead from Amelia to Nagisa, which, okay, cool lady with a sword, serious personality, and a military uniform influenced outfit. I was primed to really like her, and sometimes I do. The problem is they badly botch her by treating her as too much of a joke in way too many scenes. Blending serious stuff and comedy is an art, and done well it can do a lot to humanize everyone involved. After all, real life can be pretty funny at times, but done badly it can undermine the characters or the setting, and boy do they undermine Nagisa here. It ends up feeling like the game is afraid to be too sincere, so it has to force in a lot of wacky comedy. For one, Nagisa does the thing of a character who is only good at combat and inept in other places, which is fine, even a good setup for the inherent tragedy of someone knowing only war. And they do a bit of this, but most of the time, it's played for comedy. Usually cheap laughs at her expense that undermine the badass warrior lady thing she's got going on. And I do still like her. She's got a great dramatic arc. I just wish the game respected her more. But episode 2 is probably overall the better one, although it is short and feels like it's often trying a little too hard to cram in more characters, mostly one-off reappearances of characters from the base game and PSU characters who weren't already in Portable 2, but it does have a decent story, and while the stakes are high, it makes sure to ground things by focusing on good character writing. It's just that its treatment of the lead is not great. And it does feel like they're afraid to be sincere and afraid to write something without cheap comedy. It feels like the issue here is, it feels like writing by someone who has heard that flawed characters are good, but doesn't understand how flaws make characters better, so just mostly made characters more defined by their flaws and quirks, without any real hooks to make them likable, unless you happen to like the one joke that a given character is used for. Plus, most of these flaws aren't really overcome in a compelling way, except mostly for Nagisa's. Which brings me to the fact that there are multiple endings to each episode, based primarily on your friendship value with the main girl of that given episode. Works great in episode 2, where the ending you get is based on a decision Nagisa makes, and basically comes down to, did you befriend her enough to convince her to change and undergo character development? It's great, ties everything together, themes work. Meanwhile, in episode 1, I'm not really sure how being closer with Amelia affects the actual outcome of that one. But it does, so... Oh, and also, in Infinity, there's a cool bonus scenario if you get the best ending in episode 2. See, Portable 2 Infinity was PSO's 10th anniversary game. So they added a special mission where you run through areas based on the original PSO before eventually fighting an awesome new version of Olga Flo. I loved that fight in the original PSO, so here it's just even cooler. You even get to fight alongside Red Ring Rico, the legendary hunter of the original PSO. Now granted, the story is sort of overly optimistic, fan-fiction-y story where you happen to show up and are able to save everything, buying just enough time for the Hunters Guild, sort of a collective representation of the player characters of PSO, to save everything and get the good ending that never could have been in the original PSO. It's definitely more Portable 2's tone rather than PSO's tone, but look, it's a silly bonus mission. I don't mind it being a little saccharine. Now for the many miscellaneous details. Gear is mostly like it is in PSU, aside from the addition of elements as varying properties on ranged and tech weapons, working like how they did on striking weapons, and the removal of photon points as a gear stat since they are now a character stat. Instead, gear now has modifiers for photon point consumption and photon art effectiveness. It's a really cool change to try and add a bit more depth and variety to gear, but the game doesn't tell you about these, and the best way to find that they even exist, much less the specific values, is to check the wiki. Granted, I do enjoy the wiki game elements of some of the other games, and PSO was never particularly clear on many of its additional effects, but I've been chasing the sort of compelling gear that PSO had this entire series, so it's a little disappointing to see a step back towards that be largely buried. And armor modules really suck now. They're mostly like they were in Phantasy Star Zero, except while I criticize that game for its boring armor units, these are even worse. Zero at least had a couple unique ones, like the one that boosts your charge speed, but Portable 2 has nothing exciting. There's units that boost your regular character stats, units that boost your attribute resistance, units that give you status immunities, units that give you Mirage Blasts and SUV weapons, and units that give you special visual effects. That's it. This is especially frustrating because PSU had a unit system where they were effectively extra equipment slots with specific types. Like gloves and helmets might be in a more conventional RPG. They were another thing to improve, and often had trade-offs to consider, though endgame stuff did tend to be more straightforward best-in-slot choices. But in Portable 2, they're back to being interchangeable accessories. There's nothing here, and even stat-boosting units are less exciting than in PSU because they're vastly tuned down to balance the fact that you can now stack them. This might be the clearest example of a system from PSU being made simpler and less interesting. In addition, gear has also been changed to use level for its equip requirements, like in Phantasy Star Zero, instead of stats like in Online, Universe, and Online 2. And I've never been a fan of this change, especially in this game where there's only 4 classes with the ability to use every weapon. There could have been some potential to further emphasize your race's stats by letting, say, Newman Vanguards equip better tech weapons sooner than any other Vanguards. And this less interesting gear really does make progression less exciting because you don't really have nearly as much to go out and try and farm for. Heck, there's a really unpleasant bump when you're first getting S-rank weapons, and you basically have no incentive to farm for anything because you probably don't have the extend points to equip it. Progression is really just more focused on level and type level grinding rather than climbing the equipment ladder. Very disappointing compared to the rest of this series. On the bright side, weapon upgrades no longer require grinders, and they can no longer fail, and they're simply a money sink. Plus, if you have a weapon you really like, you can use the new extend codes and infinity extend codes to increase it to 10 or 15 stars. Still weaker than a weapon that is natively that rank, but it significantly narrows the power gap if you want to keep using a favorite. Photon arts now work like techniques in PSO and Zero, which is the same system used for the non-Scion classes of PSO2 base. So unlike PSU, they're not leveled up through use, and you just have to find higher level discs. That said, there's no requirement to learn photon arts, so for better or for worse, you can just get higher level photon arts on one character and pass them over to another character who just finished the tutorials to give them a little boost. More excitingly, we now have a visual lobby that you can walk around again. It's basic and pragmatic, and there's only one, no more planet hopping. So while this does make the game feel a little higher quality than Portable 1, I do miss the scale of being able to hop around to different planets. So it's kind of a trade-off, really. Oh, and the My Room feature is back. Kinda forgot to mention that Portable 1 removed it. Although I didn't use it too much in PSU, I've done a little bit more with it in Portable 2. It's fine. Fun even. It remains neat to see that some decorations there in New Genesis's private space date back as far back as the Gurhal saga. And hey, back at this time, it was still just nice and a bit novel to have player housing in a game. It was pretty far from expected at the time. We also see class-based drops in Phantasy Star Portable 2, kind of a compromise with the section IDs of old. Some items are more common based on your current type. I think this was in Portable 1 as well, but we know how little I was invested in that one. I actually feel kind of bad about it. Having played things in order, I played Portable 1 while Universe was still fresh in my mind, and that might have worked against me. But in Portable 2, this is a nice feature since you also get a couple of illustrations in the mission menu showing some of the highlighted drops from a mission. Which is cool as a way to help you figure out where to try farming for gear without needing to look stuff up. That bit of guidance is appreciated with the number of missions in this game. Then there's a feature where you can import a character from Portable 1. I have mismatched versions, so I can't do that, but it was there, and from my understanding you get some slightly different dialogue in an optional quest where you meet Vivian from the first Portable. Though weirdly few other dialogue changes for other characters who should know you, so it's kind kind of half-baked. And I think I forgot to mention this in my Portable 1 video, but you could actually transfer your character from PSU to that game, though only in the Japanese version. So you could technically play the entire Gurhal saga, save for episode 1 offline, with a single character imported from game to game. At the time anyway, if you were in Japan. Which I guess is kind of neat, although it's not possible for the ambition of the Illuminous protagonist and the Portable 1 protagonist to be the same person. But also we have one of the coolest features in this game, which is that you can use your characters as well as those of friends if you are able to get other people to play with in 2025 as NPC party members. And this is kind of awesome. If you're a weirdo compulsive role player like me who likes to think about your characters as being people in this world, this is great fun as you can have your characters actually fighting alongside each other. You get to build your own squad and take them all out on missions. Although you do have to level and equip them all since there's no scaling for your characters, although there is level scaling and downward equipment scaling for friend characters. I really love this since there's a lot of style points here, and it means that there's now a benefit to having a serious case of altitis if you take it far enough, because you can make a team of custom-tuned characters better than any of the NPCs. Then lastly, there's still the great character customization, just like in PSU, albeit lower res, obviously. And the customization is still really amazing by the standards of a PSP game. Just try comparing this to, say, Monster Hunter titles at the time. While Monster Hunter did have armor that changed your appearance and always looks great, it usually covers up most to all of your character's appearance. So the expressive options that Portable 2 gives you are really impressive for this time and platform. Hell, aside from this game not having an unnecessary number of face sliders, this is great for today. Never forget, PSO2 and New Genesis weren't where the series' amazing customization started. It's always been well ahead of the pack. Even the original PSO, which, while now a little outdated, is pretty damn good for something in 2000. Portable 2 is in many ways what Zero wanted to be, an actionized version of one of the past games. But unlike Phantasy Star Zero, Portable 2 actually feels like an improvement on its source material. While there are still areas where it regresses, as I found out when I finally played PSU last year, Portable 2 is more fun and intense as an action game, deeper as an RPG, and keeps more of the game it's built on top of than Zero does. I would do anything for a game that builds on the original PSO like this game built on Universe. Admittedly, it feels weird saying I want more iteration after having just said I disliked New Genesis in part because it doesn't do enough to differentiate itself from PSO2, but it's probably down to a couple of factors. I just didn't like the changes New Genesis made to PSO2 for one. PSO2's gameplay had already gotten iterated on with its update cycle, adding things like the 3-button controls and Scion classes. And also, as I discussed at the top of this, PSO2's gameplay has been the base for how the series works for more than half of its lifetime at this point. We could really use something new. At the same time though, Portable 2 is frustrating for how close it gets to perfect, while still ultimately falling short. It could have been the undisputed best game in the series in my eyes, but it isn't. It just is a downgrade in a couple areas too many compared to PSO or PSU. Loot that isn't as good as the original PSO isn't surprising. We've gone through the whole series and nothing comes close. But there's also downgrades from PSU. The loss of its great type selection, the changes to bullet photon arts, moving ranged combat away from its status inflicting role, the way the type extension system makes the weapon selection feel more restrictive while making the types feel less unique, the way they decided to standardize weapon mechanics by copying from the most frustrating mechanics of striking weapons. It's frustrating. It is really great early on when you're leveling through around the first 100 levels or so, and it's refreshing on a rebirth to get to do that without the annoying story getting in the way. But after that, it just doesn't have the great progression systems of PSU or the great loot of PSO to keep me hooked. But I do need to specify and reiterate that none of these are deal breakers. It's still one of the best games in the franchise, it's just that it could have been a straight upgrade over PSU, and it's not. That said, most of these are only issues if you've sunk your teeth into PSU, specifically online. They're issues by comparison, weaker than what came before, but maybe not so bad on their own. I mean, I didn't notice most of these when I played it back in the day, and it is one of the better choices for a game to just grind forever on. With the rebirth system and the ability to make partner characters out of your alts who will need their own gear and their own rebirths, you could spend a long time raising a team of 4 characters, each with maxed rebirths and top tier gear. I wonder if anyone's actually done this. I'm sure someone has, but I can't imagine it was quick if it was legit. Personally though, I do find this game most fun just as something I continuously come back to. I never got addicted into playing it constantly like with PSO or PSU, but I keep coming back to it. I actually made Delta's save file for this game like over 2 years ago now, and I've just sort of played a bit here and there over the 2 years I've been covering this series. Maybe PlayStation Portable action RPGs are just good for that. I often tend to find myself coming back to Monster Hunter Portable 3rd in the same way. But with that, our retrospective is nearly complete. In December, to wrap up our coverage of the main series of Phantasy Star Online, I'll be going back over everything. So, why don't you chip in with that? Let me know in the comments below if there's something you think is underappreciated about this franchise. And for now, this is Mikhail, signing off.